Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to show you how to remove the mold lines or flashing from D&D miniatures. I've already done a video on how to clean your miniatures before you paint them, and you can check that out in my playlist under Painting D&D Miniatures. What sort of equipment do you require? Well, right now I have two knives. An X-Acto knife is fine, but any sort of craft knife, something with a sharp blade. A thimble is a sensible thing to have so that you don't wind up cutting yourself. Make sure you buy one that's nice and big so you can stick it on your thumb. A brush just to brush off loose bits of plastic. And a whole lot of needle files. Now you can buy needle files from a game store or from a car accessory store or a tool store. It's not very hard to find them. And a cutting board, something you can work on so you can press up against it so you don't damage your table. So the miniature I have here is a dragon, which comes from the Wrath of a Shardalon board game, and it will have mold lines. Now you won't be able to necessarily see very many mold lines on this because it has a seam here from where they glued two sections together. But basically a mold line is when you have two parts of a mold that fit together and they create a join, and that join usually leaves little traces of plastic, metal, rubber, whatever it is that they're molding. So we're not going to use this particular miniature for today because it's too hard to actually get at anything and it won't be a very good example. The first way that you can remove a mold line is to use a knife and to slice or cut the mold line off. But this really doesn't work very well. You have to be very careful to make sure you don't actually hurt yourself. You also have to make sure you don't wind up cutting too much off because that can happen. Sometimes it's good to have a large knife and a small knife. I have two different sizes. You decide which one you need based on your hand size and what you're working with. So if you're going to cut a line off or a mold line, like the one that's running along this particular miniature here, try to make sure it's something that's nice and large when you're removing it. If you have great huge lumps of flashing that are very excessive, it's very good to try and slice them off rather than to try to scrape them because it takes a long time. Also, when you're using something that's a very rubbery plastic, then cutting and slicing is a better idea. Also, if you have large sections of metal, if you're using metal miniatures, slicing can be more useful. For this case, I'm going to put my little thimble on here, just to make sure that I don't wind up cutting myself. Actually, put it on the wrong side. Put it on the side here. Okay, so the first thing is, they say cut away from yourself, but sometimes that's just not very helpful. I find that I have to actually cut towards myself, cut very small amounts off, and you can see that it's actually very difficult to not take too much off. Sometimes this particular method is not the best option. And we'll stop right there. So slicing, that's one technique you can use. Not necessarily the best technique. The next one is scraping with your knife, which is much safer and usually more effective even if it is a slightly slower process. That's when you take your knife and you scrape along the miniature, and that is basically on a 45 angle, and you just keep scraping until the mold line is removed. The next best option for actually removing a mold line is to actually use files. Now I often use files because it's more effective. So these files are all very small. Needle files are really useful. One of the things you want to try and do though is when you're using a file, make sure you pick the right file for the job. So you want an angled triangular file for getting into little corners. You want your flat file when you want to try and deal with something that's a big flat area. A flat file is better. And then a round file or a half round file, like a half moon file, that is really helpful for getting into those curves, whether it be concave or convex. So this particular miniature, I could keep playing with this all I like, but I'm going to use the round file for this surface here, and you just basically run it along there until it's basically gone. The problem with using any kind of tool for removing flashing or mold lines is it's a really time-consuming process. So unless you're really committed, sometimes it's better just to leave the mold line there. And also it can be very hard to see them, so sometimes it's better to put a base coat or a primer and then put some dry brush over it just to pick up all the detail so you can see if the molds will actually be an issue or not. Another option other than using a file or a needle file is to use sandpaper or Those files you get for doing your nails are really handy too. You can use them as well. The last thing you might want to do if you find that there are bits of plastic or metal or whatever you're trying to take off sticking is grab a brush, a really old one, and just brush off the pieces that are sticking there. You can just use your finger and rub them off. That's it. Mold line is gone. Now, as I said, it's a very long process. It takes a long time to actually take mold lines off, and particularly if you have a lot of miniatures to do it. Sometimes it's not worth taking the mold line off your miniatures simply because you're going to lose detail, so you have to make that decision. That's everything on removing mold lines from a Dungeons & Dragons miniature, or any kind of miniature really. If you found this video helpful and informative, please share, like and subscribe. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below. Until next time, keep rolling those 20s.